Hello, I'm Dan Rather, and welcome to the CBS Evening News Online Edition. Just ahead, airport security. Some screeners at a major American airport say they are not getting the training they need. We'll investigate. Also, we'll take you to Florida to see how volunteers struggle to save nearly 100 stranded dolphins. And the political crisis and widespread criminal conspiracy we call Watergate. All these years later, questions remain. One of the men closest to Richard Nixon will answer some of them in tonight's Reporter's Notebook. It's all starting now on the CBS Evening News Online Edition. Stopping terrorism takes training. But as CBS News correspondent Mark Strassman reports tonight from Atlanta, some of the people on the front line say they're not getting it.
At America's busiest airport, the lines are often long. But some federal screeners here say their safety training falls way short.
It's not been done right. It's not been done right at all.
All federal screeners are required to get 3 hours of safety training a week by the TSA, or Transportation Security Administration. But John Summerhour says his last real training was when he was hired, right after 9/11.
Our job is to get them through as fast as possible.
Even if it means compromising safety?
Even if it means compromising safety. Somebody will come to you and say, get those parachutes moving.
Yeah, we're trying to get you through as fast as we can.
At Atlanta's airport, TSA screeners routinely have to sign a form saying they've received their training. Ricardo Richardson says his continuing training has been virtually non-existent. Do you sign?
I sign.
Because?
Well, it's a threat now. I want to lose my job.
The training is supposed to go on every week, in part because the threat keeps changing every week. And at the very least, screeners have to be taught how to recognize and sound the alarm about potential weapons.
And while some threats are obvious, some of the most deadly ones are not. For instance, C4, plastic explosive.
No, sir.
You know what it looks like?
No, sir.
No idea?
No, sir.
The Atlanta airport's federal security director blames a misunderstanding about what the TSA means by training and denies any pressure on employees to sign forms. And the TSA insists training is adequate.
We have, and again, I think the only evidence that's been turned up so far is that you had a few screeners who didn't understand how the 3 hours was counted, and then in fact much of the testing and the in-service work that's done with them counts towards that 3-hour requirement of training per week.
But TSA critics see another red flag.
What we've done is created a giant DMV from hell. We really haven't created a real security organization.
With some screeners who say they're insecure about their training. Mark Strassman, CBS News, Atlanta.
In Florida, marine life experts and volunteers are racing against the clock to rescue dozens of dolphins now stranded in shallow water. Several dolphins have died. CBS's Byron Pitts reports on heroic efforts tonight to keep the toll from rising.
They move so fluidly in deep water. From the shallow shores along the Florida Keys, water shin deep on humans can become a watery grave for dolphins. Such was the fate facing more than 60 rough-toothed dolphins stranded on a reef a quarter-mile off Marathon, Florida. Watch the rescuer to the right of your screen as he struggles to keep the dolphin's air hole above water. If he fails, the dolphin drowns. Volunteers coax the strong to the relative safety of a nearby canal. The weak weren't so fortunate. 8 rescuers were treated for hypothermia after they stayed in the water all night. It has long been legend, the relationship between man and these creatures of the sea. One mystery tonight. Why exactly did these dolphins end up so close to civilization and closer still to death? Byron Pitts, CBS News, New York.
From our Reporter's Notebook tonight, the constitutional crisis and biggest political scandal in U.S. history. The criminal conspiracy known for short as Watergate. Now, 3 decades later, you will see it from a unique perspective, the perspective of a man who was right in the middle of it. August 9th, 1974, an unforgettable image. Richard Milhouse Nixon resigns amid the shame and scandal of Watergate. With a stiff-armed wave, he bids farewell to a nation. The unraveling was triggered 2 years earlier by the infamous break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate office complex. 5 men tied to President Nixon's re-election committee were arrested. The White House, skilled at controlling the media, brushed it off as a third-rate burglary.
The forgeries were ordered in 1971 by Charles W. Colson.
As former special counsel to the president, Charles Colson was part of the White House protective armor. Known as the hatchet man of the Nixon administration, he conjured up his own share of dirty tricks.
There was a siege mentality, clearly. We surrounded the wagons and got in the center and were very protective and very defensive.
We both saw Watergate play out from our own separate points. You were President Nixon's right-hand man. I was the White House correspondent for CBS News. I know, for example, that you called my bosses trying to get me and CBS News to back off. How was the press perceived at the White House then?
Well, I would say you, Dan, and CBS generally, of course, Woodward and Bernstein, and Seymour Hersh of the New York Times were probably the most aggressive people involved in the Watergate investigation.
Tell us what goes through your mind when you hear people who love this country and people who believe in you say reluctantly that perhaps you should resign or be impeached.
Well, I'm glad we don't take the vote of this room, we say.
And so we looked upon you as the enemy. You were the forces trying to bring us down. Eventually you succeeded. And I did call your bosses and did try to put pressure on.
The president has no intention of handing over the tapes. Well, I'm not a crook.
The criminal conspiracy that became known as the Watergate scandal had become a national obsession.
I do, so help me God.
Few missed the Senate Watergate hearings and the testimony of John Dean, former counsel to the president, who said President Nixon knew about the Watergate burglary and helped to cover it up.
Believe me, dragging out Watergate drags down America.
An unrelenting press exposed a parade of top officials and their secret crimes that included wiretapping, burglary, and perjury. Back then, finally realizing that crimes had been committed and he was in the process of being, quote, scapegoated, Chuck Colson tried to save himself.
I had no knowledge or involvement in the Watergate.
In 1974, Colson spent 7 months in prison for obstruction of justice. Just before he went to prison, he became a born-again Christian, and he has remained one.
I began to see the world from the underside of life, not from the top. I know what it's like to be powerless, and so I've taken up what has been God's call on my life to speak for the powerless. Fellow sinners.
Since 1976, as founder of the Prison Fellowship Ministries, Colson has ministered to thousands of inmates.
I can look back on the wreckage of my former life and see that God redeemed it for something really important that is helping other people.
I've long wondered, and you're one of the few people still living who would know. And I'll go to my grave believing that if Richard Nixon had come full with the American people and said, wrongs have been done, I'm accountable, I'm responsible, judge me if you will, did he ever consider doing that?
Yes, Dan, and I think there were times when he knew if he'd gone forward and admitted it all, it would have saved his presidency. I don't think he couldn't quite bring himself to do that.
A lot more stories are just a click away, but be sure to join me on television for the on-air edition of the CBS Evening News. On Friday's broadcast, Remembering Tiananmen Square. The student movement there started with great hope, but ended in tragedy. We'll take a hard look at what really happened in Tiananmen Square in a reporter's notebook. For CBSNews.com, I'm Dan Rather.